following program is a presentation of Wyoming Public Radio, the Wyoming Business Report, and Wyoming PBS. From the campus of Central Wyoming College, Decision 2012, the U.S. House Debate. Hello, I'm Richard Brubaker of Wyoming PBS. Welcome to the Decision 2012 U.S. House Debate. With me are MJ Clark, editor of the Wyoming Business Report, and Bob Beck, news director of Wyoming Public Radio. This is the second of two live debates that we are broadcasting tonight. In the debate to follow, the candidates for Wyoming's only seat in the House of Representatives will face questions both from the journalist panel and then later on from each other. And the numbers, of course, were drawn earlier to determine the order of seating and answering questions. For the opening, there's no opening statements, but for the first question, you will each have 60 seconds to reply to that. And we do begin with the introduction of our candidates. And our first candidate is Republican candidate Cynthia Lummis. She is seeking her third term in the U.S. House of Representatives. Prior to being elected to Congress, she served a total of 14 years in the Wyoming legislature and 8 years as the Wyoming State Treasurer. She has a family ranch in Laramie County. The Constitution Party candidate, Clyde Cummings, was born and raised in Salt Lake City. He has been a physician for more than 30 years. He has also served as a member of 3 different state medical associations. And our next candidate is Country Party candidate Don Wills. He ran a business and raised his family in Illinois for 30 years, but in 2006 moved to Jackson Hole, and he now lives in Laramie County near Pine Bluffs. He was a Republican, then a Libertarian before joining with others to form the Wyoming Country Party. Libertarian Party candidate Richard Brubaker is a resident of Riverton and a truck driver. He has previously run 3 times for a seat in the Wyoming House of Representatives. And the Democratic Party candidate, Henrichsen, is a political science teacher at Casper College. He is also taught at Brigham Young University and Utah Valley University. He is currently working on his doctoral degree. Well, our first question to all the candidates is, please describe your qualifications to serve as the U.S. representative from Wyoming. You have 60 seconds, and of course we begin with you, Representative Lummis.
Well, thank you, Richard, and it's so nice to be here this evening on this beautiful campus in Riverton, and a lovely evening. I have lived and worked in Wyoming my entire life, and I've served in the Wyoming legislature, where I learned from people all over Wyoming about how capable Wyoming people are of governing themselves. I've taken that experience to Washington and served 4 years in Congress. First, under the leadership of a Democrat president, Democrat House, and Democrat Senate, where I learned just how strongly national Democrats feel about having a very strong, overpowering central government. And then, during the next term with the Republican House, that let me see how much more frequently Republicans trust their state colleagues. I want to return to the House to have the opportunity to represent state and individual rights, freedom, and liberty.
Thank you. Dr. Cummings.
Thank you. I appreciate being here tonight. I have studied constitutional law, constitutional history, economics, economic history, national security, and America's enemies for more than 50 years since I was a teenager. I have lived in various areas around the country, from the east to the west, the north to the south, mountains and plains, Republican areas, Democratic areas, and I know what the national problems are. Although local problems vary a great deal, national problems are the same everywhere, the ones that are critical to our national survival. I have learned what those issues are. I have learned constitutional law, economics, and the solutions that will save America and revive us as a nation.
To you, Mr. Wills.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of the listeners tonight. This is a unique opportunity for minor party candidates such as myself. In answer to your specific question, the qualifications, I'm a small businessman. I started with a business partner 30 years ago And he and I were the only employees. We built it up into a company of more than 75 employees. We split it into 3 separate companies because it was 3 separate lines of business about 10 years ago. And my partner retired, and I now have 2 businesses that I'm the owner of. So I'm uniquely qualified amongst many in the House of Representatives and in Washington, D.C., in that I truly have started a business from scratch. I understand tax law. I understand what's needed for businesses to begin to thrive and to prosper. In addition, I'm a computer programmer. I was trained as a computer programmer. I have a degree in computer engineering. And there is a sore need in Washington, D.C. for understanding of the issues that are facing the future of America with regard to the internet and to cyberspace.
Mr. Brubaker, why are you running and what are your qualifications?
I'm running for basically my children, who I consider all young people. I'm a working man. I understand the concerns and worries when I talk to people. I listen to them before I even tell them that I'm running for U.S. House and my work stained clothes. My qualifications, I was raised outside of Riverton here on a dairy farm when we started out with basically very little. And towards the end, we were selling cattle, dairy cattle, exporting them to other nations because we had such a recognized dairy. What brought us down was the fact we got overextended, and then following 2 disasters, it put us out of business. I understand the critical condition of being deeply in debt. Like I say, I talk to working people. They tell me a different version than what I hear from people that talk to them in suits and announce themselves as a candidate.
Thank you very much. Mr. Henrichsen.
I'd like to thank Wyoming PBS and for being here, and very grateful for those who've shown up here today, as well as those who are watching, whether on the internet or on TV or on the radio. I'm running for Congress because of my love for the Constitution. I'm somebody who has taught the Constitution to freshmen all over the West and who has studied it in my own studies, my own personal studies, as well as my schooling, and I have a deep commitment to those constitutional principles. I also have a deep commitment to the well-being of my children and to their future. And as somebody who has those commitments both to the Constitution as well as to the people of Wyoming, I feel that I have a lot to offer, not just to Wyoming, but also to the House of Representatives.
Thank you very much. Welcome all of you. Well, we're going to go to the next part of our debate, which is, of course, the questions from the journalists. In this part, each candidate will be asked a question by a journalist. You'll have 45 seconds to respond, and if there's a follow-up, you'll have another 30 seconds to further explain. And at that point, once we've got your answer, we will then inquire in order around the panel if the other candidates would also like to address that question. You don't have to, but it's certainly your choice. And we'll begin with the first question concerning health care. That goes to you, Representative Lummis. And it concerns the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. It's done the following in Wyoming. There are now 6,000 young adults under 26 covered by their parents' insurance. Over 100,000 patients with private insurance who now have free preventive care such as mammograms. And there's no more lifetime limits for chronic disease and no more denying coverage for children with pre-existing conditions. You don't want to continue the ACA, do you? You want to repeal the ACA. So I want to know what you would say to those families in Wyoming who now have coverage they didn't have before.
I do want to repeal Obamacare, and I want to replace it with market-centered care. And here's why. Obamacare was passed and funded by taking $716 billion out of Medicare in order to create this new entitlement program, Obamacare. Additionally, it is going to take a board of 15 unelected bureaucrats called the IPAB, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which will decide what treatments will be covered and which ones won't. On top of that, if Congress wants to change anything, it has to do it by August 15th, or else it takes full force of law. And finally, employers are going to throw their employees off of health care and into the marketplace.
Just as a follow-up on that, without reiterating, of course, the endless debate that's gone on about Obamacare, but The fact is that we've been hearing about market-based solutions for a very long time, and they haven't happened. There's still, I think, roughly about 70,000 people or so who are lacking coverage in Wyoming.
85% of Americans were covered by insurance and happy with their insurance. So we're really talking about the 15% that weren't. And there are programs, for example, under Senator Mike Enzie's 10-point plan for health care that would accommodate people with pre-existing conditions and people who are uninsured, but do it in a way that doesn't throw people on an exchange, but rather provides an opportunity for them to pursue the marketplace in a way that it provides for competition and will allow people to have continued access to health care.
Well, Dr. Cummings, what's your take on this?
I also am in favor of repealing Obamacare completely. Market solutions are what happen when the government does not interfere. Market solutions are not going to come from Congress. Market solutions will come when Congress decides to defend the marketplace and not tell the marketplace what to do. There are some sorry situations in America, but they should be left up to private charities. Those problems should not be solved by the sword of a fascist control freak police state.
To you, Mr. Wells.
Well, all of the activities of the federal government ought to be governed by their rule book, which is called the Constitution. It's sorely needed to be paid attention to by governing legislators and executive branch and the judicial system on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. So again, I would propose to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but with respect to your exact question with regard to coverage of 26-year-old dependents and other changes that the Obamacare laws put into place, those can be implemented at the state level. The federal government has no authority to make those kinds of rules. And actually, the 26-year-old rule, the state of Illinois implemented that 10 years ago. That was in Obama's time when that happened. So states are the answer.
Just in following up on the constitutional aspect, of course, in June the Supreme Court did find the plan constitutional.
The Supreme Court is not the final arbiter of truth. Period.
I'll take that as an answer. We'll go over to you, Mr. Brubaker.
Of course, I'm opposed to the Obamacare. I feel that, talking to some doctors and medical professionals, that the liability they have to face is like 55% of the cost. We need to get rid of all this liability, these lawsuits. Give the doctor, I know we have to have some controls over the doctors. But my attitude is it's forcing me to pay in. My wife's insurance was $600 before Obamacare. When it kicked in, her life insurance jumped up to $900. She had to go back to work. It hasn't done us any good.
Mr. Henrichsen.
I think the Affordable Care Act is an example of where our political system is broken, and not because of the Affordable Care Act, but because we are now arguing about complex policy decisions, basically using bumper sticker slogans. Essentially what the Affordable Care Act did was keep our insurance system as it is, but expand access to that system. It was a pretty modest change that essentially what it did is said, it was not a government takeover of health insurance, but basically said, how can we take the insurance system, the healthcare system that we have today, which is a wonderful healthcare system, and make it that everybody can benefit from that. And I think that we've done that, and what we need to be doing is saying, how can we improve on these measures rather than trying to go backwards.
Thank you. We'll try to avoid bumper sticker questions then. MJ, I believe the next one's yours.
It is, and we are continuing on health care. Dr. Cummings, you may find this an incidence of a fascist control freak police state action, but emergency rooms in this country have been mandated to provide care to everyone, whether or not they have the ability to pay for it. Most hospitals make up for this by charging the rest of us $10 for an aspirin or through inflating other costs. Since we and our insurance companies are paying for the uninsured anyway, doesn't it make sense to require that everyone get health insurance and share the cost? If you disagree, What's your plan to pay for the care of those without insurance or means?
That presupposes that Congress was right in the first place to make that law, EMTALA, which is the source of a lot of our problems. In my view, EMTALA should be repealed. The federal government under the Constitution has no authority to be policing what private hospitals do under state licenses. The repeal of EMTALA would go a long way toward getting back to pricing in hospitals that would be market realistic. And it is not for Congress to solve the problems of who gets medical care and who does not get medical care. That's a community, state, and free market question, and the solutions should come from the communities, states, free markets, and charities.
So your answer to who would take care of those without the insurance or means is their own communities?
Is not to be determined by Congress.
The same question?
I think you're going to find a lot of similarity between the answers that I give and the answers that the Constitution Party candidate, the Libertarian Party candidate. Again, I'm the Country Party, and we have similar views on certain issues. With regard to this particular issue, I agree with the Constitution Party candidate that the federal government has no authority. The states do have such authority to mandate coverage of anybody who shows up at the emergency room or 26-year-old dependents or whatever. That's absolutely constitutional under the rules of our federal government, but it is not a federal government function, so the federal government should stay out of it.
And then how would the hospitals deal with the extra money that they have to spend to take care of?
The states and charities would provide the overage. The federal government cannot be the final backstop for every single wrong that happens in the United States.
Okay, thank you.
$10 per aspirin. Try $3,000 for 2 pieces of gauze and a drop of super glue.
That's probably
Just
more accurate.
because somebody has a job. Why does a responsible working person who's paying taxes have to protect everybody who isn't? Now, that young man should be able to have a bill that is payable, not something that is inflated by others who are not being responsible and accountable.
So your response to the others who couldn't afford care is just don't give them any?
I've had a strange experience in my life when I was in the youth. I took a third trip or exchange student to a third world country where they were free. I saw a man who was going to be dead within 48 hours. I was going to give him some money. My friend said, no, you will be buying his freedom. And the man, when I put my billfold back in my pocket, looked up at me and smiled. And I learned the true meaning of give me liberty or give me death, because that man would rather not be indebted to anybody rather than die being indebted to a stranger.
Thank you.
Mr. Henrichsen.
Look, I think the question of sort of the individual mandate was essentially one with the healthcare reform that we basically said we need to find something different than using the emergency room. I know from having had to take my children to emergency rooms as they have their different falls and bruises and gashes, that those things are really expensive and are quite burdensome on a family's budget. And so, you know, if that's how we are addressing a lot of our minor care issues, I can only imagine the impact it has upon the budget. And so I think that what we are doing now is basically finding a way to get people into their community healthcare clinics, into their primary care providers, rather than using those emergency rooms, and allowing those emergency rooms to focus better on what they really do and what they do best.
Representative Lummis, I guess, what about the uninsured?
Well, many states have pools to help pay for the costs of the uninsured. There again, that is a state-based solution, and states learn from each other when they solve problems at the state level. The National Governors Association has a Center for Best Practices, and as states solve these problems in unique ways, being the incubators of ideas that they are, they can help each other learn how to solve these problems at the state level.
Thank you. Bob, you the next question.
Thank you. This is for Mr. Wells, and been trying to call an audible here and adjust it to some of your answers here tonight. But a couple things to think about. So you've got Medical expenses are the leading cause of bankruptcy in the country. My own reporting has told me in our own state that the debt collectors will tell you the #1 cause of debt in the state has to do with health care. So following your ideals, if we pull out of medicine and pull out of healthcare as a country, certainly a U.S. government, you're getting rid of things like Medicare, you're getting rid of matching funds for states to deal with healthcare problems. Doesn't that actually cause more difficulty with debt and overall finances?
You set up the issue that I consider the single most important issue facing the future of our country, and that is the debt of our country. And I know you're going to address that in a later question. But the reality is we can't afford to be everything for everybody in all cases. The federal government simply can't do everything. And if you just say, well, we should try or whatever, like, you know, to handle Medicaid block grants or whatever, it's going to cause the downfall of the United States because the dollar is going to be destroyed, okay? So in specific answer to your question, no, I don't want the states to get out of providing those functions. Those are functions that the states should provide. The backstop for poor people, the backstop for indigents, but not the federal government.
And just to follow up on that, if you unload everything on the states, how are they going to be able to afford it? I mean, doesn't this cause some serious problems?
It's not like you could do that in an overnight situation. The reality is we are so dependent, the states are so dependent upon the federal government that there is no way we could just cut the cord tomorrow morning, okay? So there will be a transition period where you could block grant some of the money, start to get to wean the states off of the federal teat and allow the states to figure out best practices. And guess what? The states that figure out the best practices, that's what all the other states will mimic. So the states are the answer to our problems.
Well, I guess my whole attitude is maybe instead of worrying about dying, we need to start thinking about reducing the government and returning to church. I know that sort of sounds a little corny, but the fact is we all turn to government for our solutions. I feel that our Constitution was not written by a bunch of people that wanted us to be dependent upon government. My mother, yeah, she was scarred because her father refused charity of any sort, and she had a brother and a sister die during Depression. It's...
Brubaker. Mr. Henrichsen.
Can I get the question again, Bob?
Yeah, I don't think I can repeat it. Well, basically,
downloading to the states, basically.
Yeah, I mean, if you unload to the states, or if you do not deal with, you know, the people that are facing some debt and certainly are not able to avoid bankruptcy because of health care, I mean, shouldn't the government be involved in something?
You know, I think the insurance industry is a large-scale national level business, and I think that it's a kind of business that has to be regulated on a larger level. Insurance is always a regulated industry. Insurance exists because it essentially has the backing of whether it's the state or the federal government. It has never existed independent from society, and as much as we want to pretend that that's possible, it's not. And these are things that we're not going to turn back to the states. We are lucky to live in a state like Wyoming that has lots of resources, but we would be doing lots of cruel things, things that I say almost verge on immoral to people who live in other places that don't have the great resources that Wyoming does. So I think that's really not an option.
Representative Lummis.
Federal entitlement programs are the drivers of our debt nationwide, and so we have to reform them to save them. Medicare is going to be broke in 12 years. So I believe that Paul Ryan has the best plan for reforming Medicare to save Medicare, and that's converting it into a premium support system, which is what I have as a member of Congress. I want people to have the choice, if they're on Medicare now, to choose what I have as a member of Congress or choose traditional Medicare. And that should apply to everyone over age 55. Those under age 55 are going to go on premium support. I would choose premium support over traditional Medicare, because then I know I'll have access to physicians. I don't know that on traditional Medicare.
Dr. Cummings.
A reasonable accounting would say that Medicare is broke now, not in 12 years. inasmuch as Medicare is already paying out more than it takes in. State and federal governments have only one source of funds. That's us, the taxpayers. It can go to the states as efficiently or more efficiently than the federal government. The difference is the federal government's debt that it uses to pay for the entitlements to keep going and the various welfare schemes, and the monetizing of that debt, which is essentially the printing of counterfeit money. The states don't have the opportunity or the legal authority to print counterfeit money in the manner in which the federal government does. That's where things have gotten out of balance.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to our next question, and it's probably you could say it's a philosophical question on the role of government. And this one goes to you, Mr. Brubaker. Because many have said this election is about a choice. It's about what is the role of government. And I wonder how you answer that question and whether your answer might be different if you were wondering if your pharmaceuticals were safe or if you were on the Jersey coast facing Hurricane Sandy. Role of government.
The role of government is to be...
How far it can protect you, and you know, would you find yourself waking up tomorrow if something happened and they weren't there, and would you regret it then?
I wouldn't, but I know our society would. And actually, I've came off a little bit hard this evening, and I didn't really mean to. You know, harsh, cold-hearted maybe. I realize that our society in general is very government dependent. I guess I kind of feel like we have to start reducing our government. It's going to be a long process. I refer to it as my libertarian mile, which I'll never see the end of. I think the role of government is strictly to protect our borders, keep us safe within our borders, and we have to do this in a slow fashion. Take a slow movement towards reducing government.
Thank you. To you, Mr. Henrichsen.
Sure, I don't think this is fair in 45 seconds to discuss the role of government, but I will do my best.
Be philosophical about it.
Okay. What I think with the role of government is an ongoing discussion, and I think in some senses we get caught up in lots of discussions about the role of government, and so in a way I disagree with your initial premise. This is not about a philosophical discussion, and I love that. That's what I do for a living, to have those kinds of discussions. But at the same time, these are about these things are about energy. They're about jobs. They're about the good of the oil rig worker, the good of the coal miner. That's really what this election is about. Now, does that take us back to issues about the role of government? Absolutely. But I think when we get caught up in sort of ideological discussions, we forget about what is important, and that's the people of Wyoming.
Well, a follow-up question on that. I mean, do you think that our society and life today is so complex that the framers of our Constitution could not foresee all of that, and there are inadequacies in how we may rely on the Constitution?
Well, yeah, I can't judge what they would have foreseen, but I think they gave us a constitutional structure that has worked well as we've gone from an agrarian society to industrial society to a technological society. So whether they foresaw it or not, they sure gave us a framework that's worked quite well for us.
Representative Lummis, to you, of course, many just this week as we tape faced the moment of truth as Hurricane Sandy hit, and Republican Governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, lavished praise upon the federal role. But the overall larger question we're facing, the role of government, how do you see it?
Well, the federal government was created by the states and the people, not the other way around. So I believe the role of the federal government is to be strong but limited, severely limited, and that the rights were preserved for the people and the states. So in the instance where Governor Chris Christie calls on the federal government to help him with a problem that the resources of the state of New Jersey cannot solve by themselves, that's an appropriate role for a state's governor to ask of the federal government. But I do not believe it's the role of the federal government to go in unless the governor asks.
Well, just to follow up on that, because when Governor Christie called FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, he called on an agency that might not exist under a President Romney, because he has, of course, called for its abolition?
The Congress of the United States has funded FEMA, and we funded it by taking a percentage off other budgets, downsizing them in order to make sure we had adequate resources within FEMA to fund natural disasters. I'm glad that money was there. I'm glad it's there to help the people of New Jersey and New York who are called upon and the federal government is called upon by the governors of those states.
Thank you. Dr. Cummings.
The primary function of government should be the protection of individual rights being properly understood. Instead, the government has become the nation's greatest aggressor and most heavy-handed oppressor of the people, with a poor understanding of what individual rights is, and thinking to a man called Bastiat, a French philosopher, who said, if you want to see if a law is good or bad, see if a person could accomplish that without a law, without doing something immoral. In other words, individual theft, governmental theft.
Thank you, Dr. Cummings. Mr. Willis.
Yes. With regard to the role of government and FEMA, the federal government has no role to play there. And for Representative Lummis to say she's in favor of a limited government, but I'll just make a couple of exceptions, I think is quite disingenuous. It's not unique amongst the people who represent us in Washington, D.C., but I believe it's disingenuous. You either believe in a limited federal government or you don't believe in a limited federal government, and you can't pick and choose whether it's social issues or indigent or flood insurance for rich people on the Jersey Shore or whatever. The point is the federal government has no business in any of those endeavors.
Thank you very much. MJ, I believe you have the next question.
I have the next question.
Mr. Henrichsen.
I do. One of the suggested ways to make Social Security solvent is to reduce benefits for everyone under 55. Since current workers pay for the benefits of retirees, what makes you think that the younger half of the population will agree to pay for something that we may never get to have ourselves?
You know, as somebody who is going to be spending a little while longer under 55, I think that Social Security is something that I don't necessarily think of it as being something of what's for me. I think of, you know, those people who are on it now, those people who are going onto it soon, you know, people like my parents, people like my grandparents. But at the same time, I think that Social Security is something that we should expect to be there when we get around, particularly if we keep in mind what the country looked like, what the life of senior citizens looked like before we had Social Security, before we had Medicare. We sometimes forget that we, in a way, are able to make these judgments because we have these things here. We have those programs that provide for those protections. So I think that there's going to needs to be changes, there needs to be long-term reforms, but I think there's no reason why this isn't something we can make long-term commitments to.
Thank you.
Representative Lummis.
Well, Social Security is also going broke, not as fast as Medicare, but it's certainly headed in that direction as well. There will be a precipitous decline in benefits in about the year 2030. So we need to reform Social Security in order to save it as well. Now, one of the reforms that I've proposed is to make today's 4-year-olds eligible for Social Security when they are 70. And that alone will close the gap to the extent of 1/3 of the problem. So there are solutions that the Social Security trustees have proposed that Congress doesn't have the gumption to pass because it's such a political nightmare in a football that the parties battle with each other. We need to set that aside to save Social Security.
Dr. Cummings.
I'm not necessarily trying to save Social Security, but if you want to save it, raise the retirement age to 80 now. That would make it comparable relative to the average longevity as when it started at 65. The longevity was slightly less than 65. Longevity today is slightly less than 80. When Social Security started, there were 30 workers supporting each recipient. Today, there are fewer than 3. It is very rapidly heading toward 2, and we're facing a train wreck. So in the end, I think we'll see the end of Social Security by its own political destruction, which will be a great forward stride for liberty.
Age 80.
80.
Okay.
Now. Not the 4-year-olds. Now.
That'll go over well, I think.
I'm 65, and I'm talking about my own situation.
Wow. Mr. Willis.
Well, if you wanted to save Social Security, which I actually would like to see privatization long-term down the road, but between now and 40 years from now, then the Constitution Party candidate's analysis is correct. When Social Security was created, the average lifespan was about 65 years old. And so the insurance that was provided to old age, to widows and so on and so forth, was for people who were beyond the the average age of death. And he's also right that men typically die at 75 and women at 80. So those are the numbers that would be in concert with what FDR created. And so, there's nothing really magical about any age, so why not move it up?
Mr. Brubaker.
Well, I guess my attitude is those calluses on those hands of these working people have paid into this. And if we just let it disappear, it's going to be theft. It needs to be returned to the people that earned it. I would like to see our young people be able to buy their way out by having a guaranteed retirement plan. Like 25 years old, have $35,000 in a retirement plan, they continue paying into it, personal. No government commitments. To preserve it for the people like myself and the 55-year-olds.
Well, let me just ask, some years back under President George W. Bush, there were serious proposals to privatize and create private accounts within Social Security. Would you be in favor of the government-run program with private accounts?
I'd be in favor of a government-certified one to begin with. Like I say, we've become such an irresponsible and accountable society. We have to learn to be responsible once again. We have to learn how to put our money into savings again because we've forgotten how. We go borrow money all the time. I'd like to see our young people be encouraged to invest in their retirement at an early age. To save Social Security, I'm willing to fire a whole lot of other people in Washington, D.C. because that's the money that people have earned and they deserve. And I don't want to be out on the highway with an 80-year-old.
Thank you, Mr. Brubaker. Bob, I believe you get the next question.
This is for Representative Lummis, and this actually came from a conversation you and I had on the radio, and somebody wanted to know, how do we address the Medicare shortfall without harming those who have actually paid into the system for many years? And this is an important second part of the question. What is so darn magic about the age of 55 if we're looking at reforms?
With regard to Medicare, specifically, the reason premium support will work so well is that the healthy and the wealthy will get less premium support. The unhealthy and the unwealthy will get more premium support. And they'll have what I have as a member of Congress, which is this. When I became a member of Congress, I was in a room, they rolled out about 8 insurance policies, private insurance policies, and said, pick one. I picked a standard Blue Cross Blue Shield of Wyoming policy. That's what I have. I pay part of the premium. My employers, the people of the United States, pay part of the premium. That's what premium support is. It works, and the reason it will work so much better than Medicare is because physicians will see me because I have this little Blue Cross Blue Shield card. There are getting to be fewer and fewer physicians that will receive Medicare patients because every time a Medicare patient walks in their door, they're losing money.
How do we transition people into that, though?
The way that it would work under Paul Ryan's plan, and by the way, his Democrat Senate co-sponsor, is that people who are currently on Medicare and people 55 and older will have the choice of traditional Medicare or premium support. Now, those under 55 will only have the choice of premium support. And the reason that 55 is so magical is because of the way that you evaluate the costs and the risks.
Move on to you, Dr. Cummings.
Again, I'm not really trying to save Medicare, but if you want to save it, Probably the most important thing you could do is means test it, take out those who don't need it, need being relative, because really no one needs to live as a parasite on his neighbor. It has been said people who will put in are entitled to get out. Sounds nice, but the money's not there. There is no way to get it out as a Ponzi scheme explodes larger and larger. The best way out of a Ponzi scheme is to cut it off, not try to keep it going, because keeping it going hurts more people.
Actually, I was going to see if you wanted to answer the question on your own terms, because if you don't support it, obviously you wouldn't want to come up with ways to save it. You do not support, then I take it, the existence of a Medicare system?
No, I do not.
Thank you.
It was a mistake to start it. It's a bigger mistake to continue it, and it will be an accelerating bigger mistake over the years, and someday will lead to bloodshed between the generations for those who want to get what they paid.
Mr. Wills.
Again, you aren't going to hear a whole lot of difference between the Constitution, Libertarian, and Country Party candidates. All of this questioning about how to save Medicare is literally talking about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Whether we're talking about means testing, whether we're talking about premium support, changing the age, changing the eligibility, whatever, however you want to try to address it. Maybe even, as the Democrats would like, turn the entire system into a single-payer system. The point is, we can't afford it. This is going to be a financial disaster for our children and our grandchildren, and that's one of the reasons I got in this race, was to try to make people aware of the train wreck that we are going to be running into in 10 and 20 years that will possibly lead to, as the Constitution Party candidate says, blood in the streets between the generations.
Mr. Brubaker, is this somewhat like Social Security for you?
No, we haven't been invested in it nearly as long. I do still feel like it's taking our money. I would like to see, instead of Medicare, same thing as an IRS, individual medical coverage, which is taken out before taxes. You can invest in it if you want. If you lose your job, that's when you can pull it out. Whenever you need, when you retire, if you lose your job, you have some coverage there. It's a person's own responsibility.
Did you mean IRS or IRA?
IRA.
We knew. Mr. Henrichsen.
I have to say I'm not in favor of a single-payer system. So, you know, as the Democrat nominee, I guess I could speak for myself on that.
Some Democrats are, as you know.
I know, and they give me a hard time about that all the time. At the same time, I think that, you know, we need to be willing to sort of fight against the idea of let the parasites die. And that's one of my deepest moral convictions. I think one of the challenges with premium support is that in programs like CHIP and some local sort of state programs similar to CHIP that have expanded CHIP to adults, premium support has not always been cheaper than programs like Medicaid. So I don't think there's necessarily any evidence that premium support will necessarily save us money. It might possibly give us some flexibility and some changes to how that program is administered, but whether that will actually save us and save us costs is not necessarily the case.
Well, thank you all. We'll go to the next question. And Dr. Cummings, it's about climate change. Do you accept the vast body of scientific research pointing to climate change, and that change would manifest itself probably in such phenomena as the drought that Wyoming went through this past year?
Depends on what's meant by climate change.
Global
yes, the Earth is warming. The primary reason it's warming is that we're in a 1,500-year sun cycle with the sun increasing its radiation. It's been doing that for quite a few hundred years, into a warming spell that is similar to one that we had 1,000 years ago, when Greenland really was green instead of ice. So those who want to put a cap on global warming have got to find a way to turn down the sun.
So you reject the body of evidence or research that points towards man-made?
I reject the propaganda that it comes from man's activity.
Thank you. Mr. Wills.
Your statement is not completely correct. There is quite a bit of disagreement, actually, between various factions in the climate change argument. And quite frankly, we haven't seen any change in global temperatures over the last 10 years. For the 15 years from about 1980 to 1985 to 2000, there was a noticeable increase in mean temperature around the world. The last 10 years, we have not seen that, okay? So it didn't meet the models that the computers, that the scientists had created in 2000, so they had to tweak their models, and now they say it's going to be 2030 before it starts up again. I'm a computer guy. You can stick little parameters in and twist the knobs and dials any way you want to get any answer you want out of computers. So yes, I reject your premise that it's an absolute complete agreement between all the scientists.
Well, obviously not my premise, but I mean, do you assume that many of those scientists have some sort of agenda they're working under?
You can't hit it with a broad brush. The reality is, yes, there are some scientists who have an agenda. There are people like Bloomberg and others who really, really want a carbon tax because they've already created the markets that would support such trading of carbon taxes. There are all sorts of various reasons that people have decided to take whatever position that is. Some of them completely legitimate, that they absolutely believe the science and they have no outside agenda. So no, you can't paint a broad brush.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Mr. Brubaker.
You're right about this being a warming period. And all you have to do is go up to timberline. Look at those little tiny spruces about yay big in the blown over areas. There's stumps this big in there. That was 1,000 years ago. This is not the first time. All this carbon in the ground was in our atmosphere at one time. I do a lot of follow-up on, I've followed this global warming since before Al Gore was a name in the thing. But I also read one that really was of interest to me, and it was this meteorologist said, yeah, God likes plants, so he created man to dig up all the carbon that had gotten buried. It's a cycle. My only big concern is if there's a major natural occurring event which will disrupt that cycle.
Thank you. Mr. Henrichsen.
You know, I have no reason to question the experts on the science. You know, I'm a social scientist. You know, my science grades weren't necessarily my strong suit as an undergrad. But I think that in a way what we need to be addressing is what are solutions that we can do. And Wyoming has a great opportunity as an energy leader in numerous different fields and numerous different sources of energy to be driving that diversity. And I think that a lot of our sort of statements on science are being driven by our politics, and that doesn't serve anybody's good.
What do you mean by diversity? What would you propose?
You know, we have coal, we have oil, we have uranium, we have wind. These are all things that we have plenty of here in Wyoming and rather robust industries of. And it's these types of innovations, the type of innovations that are coming out of the University of Wyoming, that I think are really going to be the solutions to these problems. And we really need to be looking forward rather than sort of fighting over sort of the old sort of solutions that have been thrown out, because I think we haven't found that solution yet.
Representative Lummis, what's your thought on climate change?
Well, climates do change. And it has been said, the planet was warmer 1,000 years ago than it is today. There was a little ice age intervening between the two. We're just beginning to explore what mankind's role is in climate change. So I would argue that the jury's still out. We don't understand mankind's role in climate change. But we do know this, that the United States could adopt cap and trade, and unless China and India and Russia do the same thing, it's not going to matter one whit, because those countries are consuming now a lot more fossil fuels than we are. And so to have this massive change in the cost of energy in this country, when it's not going to make any difference in climate change, is completely out of bounds.
What about a leadership role in us perhaps showing the way?
Well, we should continue to study it. We should continue to try to explore whether mankind's role exists in the change and face of climate change. But to just assume that mankind is the cause of climate change and then to begin to try to respond to that when we don't have clear, scientific, peer-reviewed conclusions I believe is tremendously premature.
So you've not seen any evidence that would convince you?
I have not.
MJ, I believe you have the next question.
I do. This one's for Mr. Wills. You've made it abundantly clear that you are against excess government spending. How about when it comes to the spending on the military? In 2011, the officially reported United States military budget was $740 billion, much more than the next 9 largest military budgets combined. In fact, not one of those 9 breaks the $100 billion mark, and taken together, they amount to just 2/3 of the total U.S. military budget. Do we really need a military that is 7 times larger than any other nation's?
I don't know if you understand this, but you just threw me a real softball.
Well.
I completely agree with all of your analysis of the situation, and we should cut the federal defense budget, which is now 20% of the total spending of the federal government, by at least 1/3. And we should bring home many of our troops from around the world and close many of our bases, not all of them. We should keep open our naval bases in the Philippines and our air bases in Diego Garcia and our bases in the British Isles, but we should bring home all of our troops from Korea, from Germany, from so on and so forth. And defend our borders, not do nation building, not be the policeman of the world, and not spend as much money as we do.
Thank you.
If it's a softball, it's a really big one.
The beach ball.
We'll go over to you, Mr. Brubaker.
After seeing my 2 children go through the National Guard, I strongly support a National Guard because I think it helps build character, which is something our society is definitely lacking. Maybe one of our biggest enemies is within. People not having the discipline to get out and do what they're supposed to. But as far as these foreign conflicts, I'm strongly opposed to them. I'd like to see, like Mr. Wells said, closing down many of the foreign bases, reducing this dependency on military contractors, which will have to be slow because I don't want to be laying off a lot of people when we have such a high unemployment rate. So got to be careful there. I'm not out to break the economy with more unemployment. But yeah, I think we need to be looking for ways to cut it.
And we'll go over to Mr. Henrichsen.
Sure. I think, like Social Security, you can't leave a huge part of the budget off the table when you're looking at how do we balance the budget, how do we address the debt issue. At the same time, you know, the Department of Defense budget is a huge, diverse amount of expenditures, and we need to be able to look at those things closely, but also realize that America has a special place in the world. We have a special role, and you know, I think that sort of knee-jerk isolationism or sort of nationalistic hubris is not what we need, but we need sensible discussion to be able to sort of tackle those issues and see how can we achieve our goals, how can we play that leadership role in the world, but at the same time be able to pay our bills and be able to do those things over the long term sensibly.
Representative.
I believe in peace through strength. So I do believe it's important that we have a robust system to defend ourselves and that we define what is our own defense and what is in our defense's best interest. That said, I have voted to cut defense spending. I voted for 3% across the board cuts. I voted for the sequester, which cuts defense spending even more, although I would love to see us now relax the amount of cuts that would be imposed on the military under sequester. And I have voted against specific spending. I've voted to reduce troops in Europe. I voted to not to build certain naval ships. I have been, I believe, responsible in the way that I address the glide path to a smaller military, but without compromising our peace through strength.
Dr. Cummings, military too big?
Perhaps. We're spending far too much on the defense of other countries. We should withdraw our troops completely from Korea and Europe. Korea and Europe are modern, rich countries that can afford to defend themselves. We should withdraw our troops from the Middle East. Because of local religious beliefs there, there's no hope that anything we do will teach them our views of individual freedom, and we should not be spilling American blood trying to do so. On the other hand, we might not be spending enough on our own defense in some areas, such as an anti-ballistic missile system. If there's anything that really does belong to the United States under the Constitution. The federal government, it's the defense of the United States. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of corporate welfare, and we should attack the corporate welfare, not worrying about unemployment.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. So you do not, or do you, support the missile reduction that has happened over the last several years as both the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and the United States both reduced their missile forces?
I'm not sure that we verified well enough that they have reduced theirs. I see no reason to trust Russia in its present form.
Trust but verify, right? I think I've heard that
How about verify first and not worry so much about the trust?
Okay. Bob, I think you have the next question.
This is for Mr. Brubaker, and this is probably, you know, where I come from in Chicago, we play with these 16-inch softballs, so this might be one of those for you by the end of the That's right, that's right. Let me ask you, there's been a lot of hand-wringing in this state about the loss of what could potentially be some $700 million in abandoned mine land funds to the state of Wyoming. I'm curious, do you agree with that cut?
I actually did reclamation on some abandoned mines. I mean, they were ones that were under the Superfund money. I've seen what reclamation can do. I also know of a few mines that are small mines, which would be Superfund mines, to clean them up. You know, once again, this is kind of where, gosh, where does the government step in? These mines have been abandoned. There's potential hazards there. What do? You know, this is one time when I do feel that the federal government might have to step in to protect downstream, downwind, which would be the protection which I'd be looking at.
Money's been spent on buildings. Money's been spent on sports facilities. It's been spent on a lot of stuff that didn't involve abandoned mines. And I think that was part of the argument for cutting the money. Does that change your view at all?
Like I say, I think the government has more of a role in protecting downstream, downwind. I don't want to see a abandoned mine up on South Pass, which could leach out into the stream and run downstream and pollute the Casper city water. That would be a disaster if they had a big source of mercury or something hit their water. I do feel that the government has some responsibility for downstream, downwind protection.
Mr. Henrichsen.
The $770 million that were supposed to come to Wyoming from the AML funds are money that we had paid into it. It was money that was owed to Wyoming. We have a good situation when it comes to our state budget here, but it's also a very fragile one. You know, we're already talking about making 8% across the board cuts in the state government, and it's essentially the responsibility of the Wyoming delegation to make sure that the state of Wyoming has coming to it what we have paid into it and what is owed to us. This is essentially back payments to us for money that we had not received before. And so my first priority in when I go to Washington, D.C. is to make sure that we find a way to get those funds back. Could we have spent that money better? Well, I mean, how are other states that actually got their AML funding, how are they spending that money? I think that that was sort of a question that, you know, hurt Wyoming, but not in a fair way.
Do you think the delegation screwed this up? They should have fought harder to keep that money?
You know, I think that the delegation, that should have been a bigger priority, that we have been focusing too much on sort of partisan causes, too much on issues related to, you know, electing presidential candidates, when we should have been saying, well, what's most important to Wyoming? And it seems that $770 million should have been priority one.
Well, we're both looking at you, Representative Lummis.
Well, that's Wyoming's money. In fact, our congressional delegation fought so hard to protect it that in order to pry it away from us, they had to steal it in the middle of the night in a conference committee that none of us were on. And we had multiple efforts to try to pull that money back. Now, here's the deal. If Wyoming were asked, as part of a huge overall package, to eliminate our debt and our deficit and to throw that money in the pot to solve it, I'll tell you, I believe our delegation would say, you bet, Wyoming's going to do its fair share. But this money was taken from Wyoming and Wyoming alone. And why? Because other states are cannibalizing Wyoming's money. We pay more into that than all the other states combined. And that money is money that we're going to be working very hard to try to get back.
And to be fair, did you screw it up?
No, we didn't screw it up. When you don't even know your money's been taken until 3 a.m. and the ink's already been signed on the conference committee report, and you had no idea it was even going to be part of the equation, that's not screwing it up. That's other people looking at monies that only one state had their money taken away from and saying, here's a state that doesn't need it, let's take it for ourselves. That was trust money. That's money that is due and owing to us. And the fact that it was sitting there in a trust fund waiting for us to have the opportunity to take our money, and it was snatched away from us by states that are cannibalizing our resources without using it to solve a major problem for our entire country is entirely inappropriate. If they can do it with our AML money, they can do it with our federal mineral royalties.
Well, I guess there's no federal insurance for that kind of theft, so. Dr. Cummings.
I think it's a little unfair to blame congressmen who were deliberately kept out of the loop by nefarious politicians for nefarious purposes. I think that's an unfair charge. But we need more enlightenment than that. Things that are really important to Wyoming are to be solved in Cheyenne, not in Washington. And the idea that we paid for it, therefore we get it back, is not going to answer any problems. The money is gone. Maybe we can get back some counterfeit money, but it's not possible for everybody who's paid for this or that or something else in our bankrupt system to be paid off honestly. It can't happen. That's not a matter of political will, ethics, or anything else. It just can't happen. We're broke.
We're out of time there. Mr. Willis, you get the last word on this one.
Yes, the delegation didn't do anything wrong. It's how Washington works. It's really sad. We shouldn't have given them the money in the first place. The state of Wyoming should have been taxing the people, the corporations who are destroying the land to do strip mining or whatever, and putting that money in our own savings account and then using that for our own mechanisms, because the state has a vested interest in making sure that our land and water is clean. So the presupposition that somehow the federal government can do this better or should be doing it or whatever is completely wrong. Wyoming should have never let that money go to the federal government in the first place, and then we wouldn't be having this discussion.
And you had no concerns about how it was spent at the state level?
Again, you're arguing over how to divvy up the spoils of taxation system that is completely unfair to one player and not to the other. Well, guess what? We got the short end of that stick on this deal. Well, there's other places where other states get the short end of the stick. It's just the way it works. The federal government is literally an organization that isn't looking out for the best interests of Wyoming. They're just trying to keep
anybody else
or whatever. They're too far removed from what Wyoming cares about. We need to solve these kinds of issues at the state level.
We're going to go to the next question. This concerns the Bush tax cuts, and it goes to you, Mr. Henrichsen, at first. The Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service estimated a 10-year revenue loss for extending the tax cuts beyond 2010 at $3.5 trillion. Now, job growth during the years of those cuts has been anemic compared to eras of higher taxes such as the Clinton administration. What rationale exists to maintain those cuts and increase the debt?
You know, I think the rationale for keeping those cuts were on a temporary basis, and ultimately it's the job of Congress from year to year to decide whether we continue these cuts or not. At a time of recession, of high unemployment, our focus needs to be on returning that economy to strength. And so the rationale there is that when the economy is bad, you don't raise taxes. You focus on getting that economy back together. Should those taxes, those benefits to the richest members of our society, should they be asked to pay a similar tax rate to the truck driver? Absolutely. But right now is not the time to rescind those taxes, but they will be something that when the economy improves, we will definitely have to address.
So you're not in favor of doing that now?
No, it's not the time to do that.
Okay. Representative Lummis, just to add one thing, which is, this is actually a question from our friends over at WyoFile. It says the Bush tax cuts have been in place since 2001, so where are the trickle-down jobs?
We need overall tax reform. That means reducing our tax rates, eliminating some of the corporate welfare and lobbyist special interest monies that have been carved out in the tax code, and we need to have a flatter, fairer tax structure. Now what that will do is help our economy grow, because we have money parked overseas that people will not bring back to the United States and repatriate, because our taxes, our corporate taxes, are so much higher than other industrialized countries. If we would do an overall reform of our tax code, our whole economy would grow. And when our economy grows, we have more jobs, we have more people paying taxes, we have more people earning livable wages. It's better for the whole country.
But that's the rationale that was instituted at the beginning of the cuts, and yet job creation remained very weak throughout many years following.
Actually,
how do you account for that?
Actually, that's not the rationale of those cuts. Those cuts were not overall tax reform. They were carving out little special components of the tax code. What we need is a complete reform. Our tax code is too complicated. It is too riddled with exceptions and special interests. We need to lower our rates. We need to broaden the overall base. That means fewer deductions, fewer credits, fewer goodies in the tax code, and we need to be able to repatriate, bring back some of the money that's parked overseas, so it'll be invested here, so that we're creating jobs here, so we're growing our economy here.
So in general principle, you would agree that the wealthier should pay a no lower rate than a person who is in the middle income area? And would that include capital gains?
You know, I could support a two-tiered marginal rate system. I'd prefer a one-tiered marginal rate system.
Flat tax?
I like flat tax. But if we had a two-tier system, one at 10% and one at 25%, where the top taxpayers are paying 25%, and the lower rate is roughly 10 or no more than 10. That would be something that would be revenue neutral, but that would go beyond that, because it would really energize our economy and create the kind of robustness that we need to grow.
Okay, fair enough. We need to move along. But just a quick yes, no, would that include capital gains?
You know, I don't know.
Okay, I'll take that as the answer for now. Dr. Cummings.
Let me address capital gains first. I will not support any increase in the capital gains tax unless the capital gains is indexed for inflation. Otherwise, we're taxing something that's not really income. Second, general taxation. I am concerned more about the ethics than I am about the economics. The government is too big, way too big, 2 or 3 or 4 times as big as it should be. I'm not trying to finance it. I'm trying to choke it off with low revenue. And so I'm not in favor of having any more revenue in the federal government than it presently has.
Mr. Willis.
Whether or not we reinstitute or let the Bush tax cuts expire is truly small ball. In the whole scheme of things, it really isn't that relevant. Right now, we have a spending that we spent, let's say, $100 on. We only take in $60. There's $40 there that we are either borrowing or printing. Now let me repeat that again. We spend $100, but we only take in $60. Most of that $60 comes from the personal income tax. Very little actually comes from the corporate income tax or any other sources. So the point is, we're having the wrong discussion here, and actually all of this discussion that they're having in Washington, D.C., that's all smoke and mirrors. That's all just to make it look like there's 2 sides to this issue. There isn't. The reality is we're broke, and there is no way that we're ever going to be able to get out of that with our current spending.
Mr. Brubaker, get the last word on this one.
First of all, we can tax everything and anything we want, and we can do it any way we want to. But the whole fact of the matter is, the only revenues that this government really has comes from the people involved in working private industry. Oil and gas would be worthless if everybody's unemployed. You know, the whole thing boils down to the taxes. And the people I talk to when I'm out there in my work clothes are tired of taking home very little of their money. And when you explain to them that their actual tax load is far higher, we've got to reduce the government. There's a number of people, working class people out there, truck drivers, miners, whatever, have told me they don't even know if they want to go back to work on Wednesday or not.
Okay. We're going to go to another part of the debate right now, which I'm sure all of you have been waiting for. And this is the part where each of the candidates will have an opportunity to ask a question of two of the other candidates. So you get to choose. And we will allow 15 seconds for the question and 1 minute for the answer. And Representative Lummis, you do get to ask the first question. Who are you going to ask?
Well, I would ask Chris, first of all, would you vote for Nancy Pelosi for the leader of the Democrat Party in the House as she is now if you were elected to Congress? And conversely, I'd ask my colleagues who are not—
You have 15 seconds for the question. That does sound like a question.
Okay.
You know, at this point, Nancy Pelosi has no idea who I am. I think for me, I would prefer to see Steny Hoyer or somebody else give a shot. I think that, you know, Representative Pelosi has had her chance as Speaker of the House, and that, you know, we benefit from having somebody else in leadership. And so that's the direction that I'm leaning on that now.
Dr. Cummings, you get to ask a question of one of your fellow candidates.
Cynthia, would you hold the line on capital gains unless it's fully indexed to inflation?
Yes.
That was easy.
It doesn't
And
have
how
to be a
about other
one-minute answer if you
taxes?
don't want it to be.
In which money is earned by the passing of time, such as interest?
Well, let's talk about, for example, the death tax, which is certainly one that you'd have to have a stepped-up basis if you were ever going to have. I believe in eliminating the death tax first and foremost. But since Congress, last time they had an opportunity to vote on it, reinstated it, they at least did it at 35% with a stepped up basis. And that gets to your point of indexing. By having a stepped up basis in the death tax, if we're going to have one at all, which I abhor, but if we're going to have one, it has to have a stepped up basis for the very reason you described.
Mr. Wills.
Do I get to ask two?
You'll ask one now.
One question.
And one in just a little bit.
Okay, so one question.
One.
Earlier, the Democratic candidate,
Who are you going to ask it to?
Mr. Henrichsen.
Thank you.
The Democratic candidate stated his bona fides as a constitutional person who knows the Constitution. Do you believe there are any limitations to the Commerce Clause, to the various other clauses that have been abused, in my opinion, through the years to basically allow the federal government to run roughshod over everything that the states do?
Sure. I mean, I think Chief Justice Roberts expressed that in his unwillingness to support the Commerce Clause as a justification for the Affordable Care Act, but instead his viewing it as supporting it under the tax and the taxing power. So there are of course limits. I think primary limits that we put on the powers of Congress are essentially the checks and balances that we have. That it's the deliberations between the House and the Senate. And if you read Madison, that's essentially where he thought the limitations were going to come from, was from those deliberations and from the different geographical and different economic interests involved, that those types of deliberations were going to put a check on what we use the Commerce Clause for. And, you know, we have to stay true to the idea of, you know, what was set forth.
In the Supreme Court, they do cut you off, so I'm sorry. Mr. Brubaker, you have the next question.
Well,
tell us who you're going to pose it to.
I'll pick on Mr. Henrichsen here again. Do you feel like education should be a community-controlled or a federal government-controlled?
community should be in the driver's seat when it comes to education. I see my own children's schooling, what happens when you have micromanaging. I have children who are brilliant, who are very good at test taking, but who are essentially constantly being focused on standardized testing, and they're losing out on a lot of the richness that they should be getting out of their educational experience. And so in a way, we need not only people who are good test takers, but people who are critical thinkers, who are future members of panels like this. And so I think the communities need to be left to sort of gauge those interests, particularly in a place like Wyoming, where we have very unique needs in not only small cities like Casper and Cheyenne, but in very rural areas. Those needs and those demands for education are going to be different than they will be in the suburbs of California or in the big cities on the East Coast. And so the local areas need to be in the driver's seat, with the federal government ensuring civil rights as well as offering assistance in areas where they just don't have the resources that we here in Wyoming are blessed to have.
Well, Mr. Henrichsen, grab a breath, gather your thoughts, because you have the next question.
Congresswoman Lummis, you have stated clearly that you look forward to being in a Republican House with a Republican Senate, with a Republican president. And we'll know one Tuesday night how that plays out. But with the AML funding, you missed out on the funding, even though you were in the Republican majority of the House. What makes you think this will be any different in the future?
Well, the loss of the AML monies occurred in the middle of the night in the Senate Conference Committee with the House on the Transportation Bill, and it was proposed by the senior Democratic senator from Montana. So it was a Democrat proposal that to take away Wyoming's money, and Wyoming's money alone. Then, after our senators discovered just a few hours later that our money had been taken, they made every effort to track down the conferees, but the conference committee report had already been signed. Then, when there was an opportunity later for me to ask the House committee chairman on appropriations not to side with the senior senator from Montana, he would not take my calls. I'm offended by that. That is my Republican committee chairman, and I'm a member of that committee. And I'm tremendously offended that the Appropriations Committee chairman in the House, member of my own party, would not take my call to discuss this.
And we'll have to let that one go at that, but you do get the next question.
Well, my next question then is for the gentlemen, if I could, that are representing minority parties. Would you please explain, as you did to me, why you are trying to get on the ballot? Why, when there's so many similarities among you, that there are three parties? And might I have the liberty to ask each of them to explain the significance of the House race to minority parties? Well, I'll tell you what,
you've already asked a pretty substantive question. I'll give each of you 30 seconds. We'll start with you, Dr. Cummings.
The peculiarities of Wyoming state law. I had my eye on a different office earlier this year. Okay. My party came to me and asked me to run for the House because 2% of the House vote is the only way to preserve ballot accessibility without doing signatures every 2 years. It's a problem in the Wyoming state election code.
Mr. Willis.
Yes, it's a fair question, and then the second question that follows on, the Constitution Party candidate has it right. There's a 2% requirement for each of us to be able to have our party be on the ballot in 2040. Ideologically, the difference between the three of us, why didn't we just turn into one party, is quite simple. The Libertarian Party is too radical on drugs and on immigration, and the Constitution Party is too radical on social issues and the separation of church and state. And so the group of people that I represent disagree with those two parties on those issues.
I won't say which one is Goldilocks. Mr. Brubaker.
2%. 2%. We have to have 2%. Okay. It's only for the House. Next election, we'll have, what is it, 2 or 3 offices.
So you're saying it's a strategy rather than politics?
We have to stay on the ballot.
Okay.
It's a strategy.
It's a
It's
strategy,
all
yeah.
about strategy.
I think that probably answers your question, Representative.
And next
You
year...
can't fix it. Only our state
Well, no, we do
legislature
have
can
to
fix
go
it.
on
and
because
it's
actually
the House, the Governor, and the
Representative?
Secretary of State.
Don't take time from Dr. Cummings because you get the next question.
Mr. Henrichsen, how high, I want a figure here, how high will the national debt have to get before you decide this is the end? We stop at cold here. We don't worry about what checks don't go out. We don't worry about who gets hurt because the whole country is going to be destroyed and put into ruins if we don't.
I think that there's the assumption that you're making is that we are basically at an apocalyptic point in our situation. And while many people paint it that way, it is a serious problem that the Constitution has given Congress the powers to solve. And so I think that the only reason why we're at this problem is because Congress and the President have failed to address those problems. Our problem is political will, not the problem of the debt and the deficit.
Mr. Willis.
I have a question for Representative Lummis. You're right that the Congress can solve this problem. One of the major problems we have is the fact that the Federal Reserve prints our money now. Let me say that again. The Treasury doesn't print our money. The Federal Reserve prints our money.
Your question.
The question is, would you change that to be the way it was 40 years ago, that the Treasury prints our money? Would you support a bill to do that, to end the function of the Fed that prints the money?
Willis.
I would start by auditing the Fed and making sure that we have some transparency so we have a better understanding of what they're doing. So there's a first step before eliminating the Fed for me, and that is having an audit, understanding exactly what they're doing, and then next steps would have to be taken after we have a thorough understanding based on that audit of those next steps.
We'll move on to Mr. Brubaker. We are running tight on time. Your question, please, and to who? You don't have to. It would be kind if you could give your time to Mr. Henrichsen. Our timekeeper will be very happy.
Yes. I'll focus this to Dr. Cummings, just to return a question for you. You've been quoted as saying that there's no reason necessarily that we should provide health care, and in some ways said that there is no right not to die, particularly given these types of situations. What I'm curious about, are you aware that the 9th Amendment is pretty clear in saying...
You're out of time, by the way.
That we're not limited to those stated rights?
All human rights are variations on a theme of the right to be left alone. That's quite easy to understand with religion. I can worship what I want, Jesus, Mohammed, the sun or the moon, and nobody can touch me about it. Same thing for freedom of the press, freedom of speech. I can say what I want, I can write what I want, and not answer to anyone. You can't have a right to medical care unless it implies a right to somebody else's living, somebody else's property, somebody else's labor to provide it. I don't have the right to practice my religion at my neighbor's expense, and I don't have the right to have medical care at my neighbor's expense, at least his forced expense. Charity, fine. Forced expense, no. The idea that he owes me for my medical care under the force of law is as wrong as he owes me for my religious contributions.
Thank you, Dr. Cummings. You are out of time. And now, of course, the time has come for closing remarks. Each of the candidates will have 45 seconds, and we begin with Representative Lummis.
Well, thank you. This election is the choice between two futures. We are either going to continue down the path that we are on, towards a European-style social democracy, where we're managing our decline as a nation, or we're going to turn in the direction of growth and opportunity and recognize that earned success is a virtue, not something that we should be penalizing. This election, I'm asking you to support Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and Cynthia Lummis and John Barrasso. I'm asking for that because I believe we offer the best 5-point plan for returning our liberties and having a robust economy that will help us dig out of the tremendous debt we're in. Paul Ryan's the only person who has a plan to eliminate our debt and our deficit without raising taxes. Thank you.
Dr. Cummings, 45 seconds.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. We have reached a time of national debt where I think we need to stop it cold now. Not 4 years from now, not 10 years from now, not some indefinite time in the future. I will propose a constitutional amendment that repeals Congress's authority to borrow money on the credit of the United States and compel the payment of the national debt over 50 years.
Mr. Wills.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the audience tonight. I was saddened that you didn't ask any questions about financial issues of the banks, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. dollar, because that's my primary concern. The U.S. dollar is in the process of being destroyed by the banksters on Wall Street and the powers that be in Washington, D.C. And if you believe that there's any substantive difference between the Democrat and Republicans who run Washington, D.C., I've got a bridge to sell you. The reality is the power elite, the ruling class of America, is not looking out for your best interests and couldn't care less about the Constitution. Vote for a third party and you will make a statement that you care about your future.
Mr. Brubaker, 45 seconds.
Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I would like all the voters out there to sit down and give them two choices of letters to write. They can either write to the big government, bureaucracy, and all the contractors as to why they're more important than their children. Or they can write a letter to their children explaining to them why they were so afraid to reduce government. We've got to reduce government. I talk to people all the time out there that work and support this government, work in the oil fields, everywhere. They're crying to have this government reduced. Don't waste your vote on more big government. Vote for reducing it.
Thank you. Mr. Henrichsen.
Thank you. This has been a blast. It's actually been really fun as running for office, and one of the best parts about it is we've been able to go to all 23 counties in Wyoming and to get to know the people of Wyoming better and in many ways be able to represent them. I often, we talk about money and politics, and I can truly say that there's some people who've donated to my campaign who I'm looking forward to fighting for, and I'm fighting for them. One of those people is a neighbor who is worried about his future, and he came to me and he said, I want you to fight for Wyoming coal because I'm worried about my job. And I told him, that's why I'm doing this. I'm fighting for Wyoming. I'm not here to fight for a political party. I'm not fighting for any political figure. I'm not fighting for any sort of ideological axe to grind. I am fighting for the people and the families of Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Henrichsen. And that is all the time we have for this U.S. House debate. And our thanks, of course, to our candidates, our guest journalists, and of course, you, our viewers. And remember, in the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves. And the only way they can do this is by not voting. So, civics lesson over. Thanks for joining us.